Hello everyone, this is a story about Qatar, a country always known for its wealth, its crazy ideas, and for Vietnamese people, we know Qatar through the country's hosting of the 2022 FIFA World Cup. And the Qatar U23 team also met the Vietnam U23 team at the 2018 AFC U23 Championship in Changzhou. But this will only be a story about culture, geography, and the history of Qatar. We will talk about football in another segment on a different YouTube channel. First of all, it must be said that Qatar had a very big ambition to build the name and brand of this country. The 2022 World Cup was brought to Qatar at an estimated cost of about $200 billion US. This event is considered a revolution for a nation that had never before been able to participate in the World Cup. More deeply, Qatar positions itself as a regional sports hub, organizing plans and tournaments that bring together all the strongest national teams in the world. When it had the right to host the World Cup, Qatar committed to building 12 new stadiums with cooling technology to avoid the heat, because everyone was concerned about the heat in Qatar. The first stadium with air conditioning is the Khalifa Stadium in the Qatari capital, Doha. This stadium has a capacity of only 40,000 seats, which is equivalent to the Mai Dinh National Stadium, but don't be fooled by the number of seats into misjudging its scale. Inside, there's an extremely modern system. The grass is, of course, of the best quality in the world. And the expensive part is the equipment systems. However, this is still not the most expensive stadium in Qatar. The government of this country has also invested and built many other magnificent stadiums. Returning to the story of the country's geography, Qatar has a difficult climate, very hot, extremely dry summers, and temperatures that can reach 45 to 50 degrees Celsius. Almost the entire territory of Qatar is a desert with very sparse vegetation, and animals are also extremely scarce. Natural canals with a continuous flow are something extremely luxurious. Drinking water is produced by desalination of seawater. With a country where you see desert everywhere, the biggest natural hazards of Qatar are all related to sand, including sandstorms or giant dust storms. Qatar is a country with a modest size in terms of area and population. The area of Qatar is 11,481 square kilometers, so this area is just slightly larger. Compared to the area of Manchester province of Vietnam, only population is 2.8 million people, equivalent to London province of our country. The area is small. The population is small, but Qatar's greatest pride is its per capita income. According to IMF data, in 2021, Qatar's GDP per capita was $59,243 per person per year. This number is in the top 10 in the world. There was a time when this number for Qatar was always at the top, but that was the story of more than 15 years ago. And Qatar's GDP per capita is half that of Luxembourg, the country with the highest per capita income in the world. In terms of geographical location, as is known, Qatar is located in the Middle East, and this country only has a short land border with Saudi Arabia. Therefore, if you want to enter Qatar by land, you have to go through Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is also a major competitor of Qatar in the region. Otherwise, you can reach Qatar by sea or air. Air travel in particular is the most common route. Generally, Qatar is a flat country because even at Qatar's highest point, a peak, this peak is only 103 meters high. This means that the highest peak in Qatar is even lower than many of Qatar's high-rise buildings. With such a location, such terrain, and with so many deserts, only 5% of the land in Qatar is used for agriculture, and they mainly grow date palms. When visiting Qatar, perhaps you should buy some dates as a gift. Before getting to how rich Qatar is and how lavishly they spend, let's continue to learn a bit more about Qatar's population and geography. This country has absolutely no forests, not a single forested area. Only occasionally does a tree grow somewhere. Qatar is one of 4 countries and territories in the world without forests, along with another country in the Middle East, Oman, one in Europe, San Marino, and Greenland, which belongs to Denmark. Therefore, for tourists, if you're thinking of camping in a forest in Qatar or finding a resting place under cool green shade, that is a mistake. There are many articles on Vietnamese social media, and even in mainstream press sources talking about countries with very imbalanced male to female ratios. But perhaps people forget about Qatar. Qatar is one of the countries with a very imbalanced male to female ratio. This country has a population of about 2.8 million people, with a ratio of 3 men to 1 woman. Why is this so? Because the population in Qatar consists of many immigrants. Unlike in Monaco, where immigrants are millionaires and billionaires, in Qatar, immigrants are usually people from less developed countries. They do manual labor or heavy work, and that is why there are more men than women in Qatar, with such a significant difference. Qatar is also a country known for having one of the highest rates of billionaires and millionaires per capita in the world. Qatar's wealth is most clearly demonstrated in the fact that there's nowhere else on this planet where you can go out and meet a billionaire. Go out and meet a millionaire like in the capital Doha. And it must be affirmed that life in Doha, Qatar will be representative of the image of this country because over 90% of the population in Qatar lives in the capital. According to statistics from the Boston Consulting Group, more than 14% of the population in Qatar owns at least USD 1,000 in their accounts. If we look at the global scale, only 0.9% of the population owns assets of USD 1,000 or more. Therefore, if you have about 20-something billion in your account, you should be happy because you're one of the luckiest people on this planet. If we break down the population, for every 100,000 Qataris, 8 are super rich with huge assets in the bank. Being so rich, what is life like? People in Qatar enjoy a rich life from birth. They're born as elite individuals. All Qataris receive free medical examinations, education, and hospital stays. No one has to pay monthly electricity or water bills or taxes to the government. The people of Qatar have never had to worry about struggling to make a living like in many other countries. But of course, there's a classic saying, no work, no food. Everywhere is the same. Ordinary activities that we often have to do ourselves are all done by helpers. Heavy work, such as construction, is also done by hiring workers from abroad. And when flying, the preferred airline must be Qatar Airways, one of the most prestigious airlines in the world. This airline is considered a flying marvel in the sky. The capital, Doha, is a shopping paradise with duty-free goods and bustling shopping centers. This is a place that attracts the wealthiest people from the richest places in the world to shop and spend dollars. And in Qatar, you can see supercars and yachts everywhere. If in some other country, you might be proud. Like Vietnamese people sometimes say that England may not be a rich country. But England players always have supercars. In Qatar, you see players everywhere. Driving a Mercedes, a BMW, or an Audi is too ordinary. Here, if you want to show your status, not to mention a yacht or a private jet, you must at least have a limited edition supercar from a famous beat. If you missed out on buying one, you'll have to settle for buying a regular car and then gilding it with gold for fun. Just a bit of fun about Qatar's wealth, but now we will find out why Qatar became so rich. In fact, Qatar used to be a very poor country, one of the poorest countries in the Middle East. For most of the 20th century, this country was located in a barren area. As mentioned, only 5% of the land is arable, so what was there to eat? The people here were very poor. Typical jobs were diving for pearls in the summer and herding camels in the winter. For many decades, Qatar lagged far behind its neighbor Saudi Arabia, a major rival of Qatar. Saudi Arabia had found oil and exploited it more effectively than Qatar for a very long period. Actually, it's a bit unfair to Qatar to say that, because in 1939 they had already found oil, but the reserves were not significant. It was not until the following decades that Qatar began to exploit and use oil effectively and find more oil fields. To visualize this, by 1950, Qatar was only just beginning to open the country's first schools, hospitals, and power plants. And by 1971, Qatar had become one of the oil powers. Crude oil and natural gas are considered the pillars of Qatar's economy, accounting for more than 70% of the country's total revenue. Qatar has the third largest natural gas reserves in the world and is the second largest producer of natural gas on the planet. But like many other Middle Eastern countries, to avoid dependence on oil and gas, Qatar has made efforts to diversify its economy. Qatar accumulated a national fund with hundreds of billions of US dollars from oil and gas revenues to invest. This fund will invest in large companies around the world, such as Barclays Bank, or car manufacturers like Porsche and Volkswagen. And one of the most famous deals to promote the investment fund's name was the acquisition of the Paris Saint-Germain football club. Buying shares, buying companies, buying football clubs, that's normal. Qatar has now become one of the countries that owns the most real estate in London, England. And speaking of Qatar and its prosperity, recently I was following on Facebook, and there was a question like this: why do the rich countries in the Middle East still have to import sand? This is simple. Just Google it and you'll find the answer. According to explanations, sand can be divided into many types based on the size of the sand grains. And determining the size of the sand grains is very important for construction. Sea sand and desert sand, the sand in Middle Eastern countries, rarely meet the requirements to be used as construction materials, especially when it has not been processed. Because desert sand is fine and smooth, it does not adhere to surfaces and does not have enough chemical bonds in many directions. If the sand grain size is too small, the mortar will be slippery and lack strength. Similarly, sea sand is also very round and smooth, but sea sand also contains salt and a portion of seawater. Therefore, it can corrode steel, reduce the load-bearing capacity of steel, and reduce the lifespan of the structure. That is why, even though sand is abundant in the desert and on the beaches, these countries still have to import sand for construction purposes. Continuing with the final part, these will be interesting facts about Qatar. In Qatar, there is a sport besides football that is very popular, and that is camel racing. This is one of the sports considered to be for the aristocracy. Previously, the camel jockeys were young children who sat on the camels' backs, racing at high speeds, which was very dangerous. Later, due to various objections, Qatar managed camel racing in a special way, by using robots. There are robots with arms that whip the backs of the camels to make them race. All of these robot activities are controlled remotely using smartphone apps or other smart devices. Qatar is known as the safest country in the world. There are many aspects to this safety. The first aspect is social. The crime rate in Qatar is among the lowest on the planet. The second aspect is natural, meaning that the country is almost completely immune to natural disasters except for those mentioned at the beginning, like sandstorms. For example, people living in the capital, Doha, are mostly in buildings and are not greatly affected. Scientists have researched and found that there's only a 0.1% chance of an earthquake occurring in Qatar. Therefore, tourists can be extremely confident about their trip. The next interesting fact, which is also an obvious one, is that gasoline in Qatar is extremely cheap. In general, many countries worry about gas prices, especially in Vietnam, where we worry about gas going up this way or that way and what it would be like to fill up tomorrow. However, in Qatar, it's not like that, partly because they are wealthy and partly because gasoline is cheap in Qatar. As Vietnamese people would say in colloquial terms, it's as cheap as bottled water. Therefore, there's a piece of advice for tourists visiting Qatar. Feel free to rent large displacement vehicles and drive around the country without worrying too much, because the cost of gas is so low. Whether it's because of this or not, Qatar is among the countries with the highest per capita CO2 emissions in the world. And that's all I wanted to mention in the story of Qatar, a wealthy country with bold ideas, the host country of the 2022 FIFA World Cup. It's a country where, if you just open the door, you will meet millionaires, you will meet billionaires, and if you were born and raised in Qatar, you might also be a millionaire. Thank you for your interest in this story. If you found it interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share. And now, it's time to say goodbye.